Oneiropaths by Cisco. I'm not sleeping well, Amelia said in answer to my question. May I tell you about it, or do you have to go? I don't have to be back at the office until 4, I answered. It was barely past noon. Amelia sighed and permitted her head to droop onto her arm. Her large, bruised eyes were glassy, unfocused. Do you remember when we used to tell each other our dreams? She asked. We had been friends for so long that I couldn't clearly remember how I had first met her. I dimly recalled that our mothers had been friends, and we must have lived in the same neighborhood, perhaps on the same block. I could remember her as a little girl, skipping around the corner of her house, her white dress flashing in the sun, fleeting after images of her dress capering in pink and teal. We didn't attend the same school. We were never in love. We were simply in each other's lives, like the trees and the sky above the city, and like the city itself. I remember a park we used to visit. There was a shallow fish pond we liked, and there was a whimsical statue of a fish with staring eyes who gushed water through a wild leer not far from the big round rose planter. Even now, the memory of those days wells up in me, but what I remember are the screens and billows of dazzling sunlight, the dry warmth of the air, and the fragrance of baking stone and pine needles. Amelia's high, clear voice sifting through the glare, her hand in mine, like another breath. I'm not sure, I said. It must have been a long time ago. She nodded, eyes lowered, then pinched the bridge of her nose with a grimace. Are you having nightmares? I asked. A troubled look came into her face then, and she shook her head, waving her hand. That's not quite the problem, though, she said. My dreams are the same as they've ever been, as far as I can remember. I still dream about ordinary, everyday things, but you know how it is. It's as if, well, you were in your waking state. Your attention holds everything, all the objects and people, the world as it pertains to you in their usual places. But when you fall asleep, your attention slackens its grip on those things, and they drift away from their spots and into different relations with each other. The dream is the story these things tell when they get scrambled up, usually. Although sometimes you get a special dream that seems so far-fetched you can't begin to trace it back to any ordinary thing. In all my dreams now, I think, all the ones I remember, there's someone I don't know, that I've never seen before. It isn't a stranger or someone I've forgotten. I know I've never seen this person before in my life, except in other dreams. I know it. Just as I know when I am introduced to someone that I have not been introduced to them before. The way I just know that I don't know them at all, even by appearance, even as a figure in the background. So I know this person is not known to me at all, except in my dreams. What does he look like? Is it a he? Yes, well, there's nothing wrong with his appearance. But his eyes, or the way he watches, keeps me from being able to understand his appearance. I couldn't describe him to you except in generalities. Did something happen around the time you started seeing this person? Nothing, nothing. She shakes her head decisively, but without energy. I can't even recall when exactly I first saw this person in a dream. I tell you, there was nothing in the world, in my waking life, that would put him in my dreams. And he menaces you? She remains silent for a moment, her eyes closed, her hand over her brow. He watches me dream. He's a stranger, and he watches me dream. I'll be, I don't know, doing something like pouring tea, or even just gazing out a window at a garden or children playing, and then he'll be there watching me. Not judging me, not following me, just watching me the way you watch a play, for the pleasure of it. He's always the same, although his clothes will vary. He is like anyone you would see in the street, well dressed, well groomed, but he's polluted in his body. He isn't sick. he doesn't bring the feeling of sickness with him. He pollutes my dreams with his staring. His staring makes my dreams for him, and makes me for him. It's like I'm performing for him. Perhaps telling me about him will help you to remember. She didn't answer or meet my gaze, but only lowered her head listlessly and pressed her hand to the base of her throat. Or it might ease your mind, at least, I added. I wanted to help her to believe that everything was fine and that whatever she was experiencing in her dreams, even in her nightmares, was nothing really out of the ordinary, since I always insisted that things be ordinary myself. There's nothing unusual about his stature or his size or his bearing. He's not old. Perhaps he's young. He has a mustache, brown hair, like everyone, the same kind of clothes. They're a bit modish, new, tailored clothes. He always has his hat on. It's a boater sometimes. Sometimes it's a Homburg, or what do you call them? A Kossuth hat. That's in cold weather. In cold weather, he wears a long coat with a fur collar, or perhaps it's velvet, and he wears gloves. In warmer weather, he dresses lightly. You see, she interrupted herself. It's useless. I could be describing anyone. He has no scars, no spectacles. He doesn't wear flowers in his lapels or any sort of badge, nothing. I simply see the sort of man you pass dozens of times a day on the street. Brown eyes, brown hair, not tall or fat or short or thin, not young or old. The distortion is in the way he looks at me, not in his body, but he is still polluted in his body. But you see, he isn't threatening to do anything to me. You see that? He's already doing something to you by watching you. Exactly. And this is how often? Every night, she said, shaking her head slowly. Every night. It's gotten to the point where I start awake the moment I glimpse him. I can't sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. I now have to fight to stay in the dream and let him go on watching me if I'm going to get any sleep at all. That's the worst part. I'm being forced to surrender to him. Otherwise, I won't be able to sleep. Amelia's story troubled me, and for days after this conversation, I racked my brains for some solution to her problem. What if she were hypnotized before she went to sleep, or if she were to take a medicine that would ensure dreamless sleep? Should she go to an analyst or to church? In time, I told myself in some ungenerous moments, when I had begun to irritate myself with futile speculating, she would get used to this disgusting, anonymous figure in her dreams. There's nothing so terrible that people can't get used to it. Some may even come to miss it when it's gone. But then the image of this staring, nondescript individual watching my oldest friend in her dreams would come back to upset me. Startling, disturbing, this ominous, uncertain malice, callous probing, brutal clinicalism, showing me the utter stupidity and pointlessness of all my well-intentioned suggestions. Amelia's problem was not one that had any practical solution. It was the kind of problem that is woven directly into someone's very life. There are problems we solve and problems we live with, and when we see people who have learned to live with terrible problems, the ordinary way they have about them makes it easy for us to forget, or never to notice, the merciless persistence of the problem, the way its agony has made itself into the root and stone of an ordinary life. We want to think that adaptation is a cure, when in reality it isn't even a palliative. It's usually nothing more or less than the difference between death and being able to live in pain. Amelia had stopped visiting people and now saw almost no one. How could she, when she could no longer find in sleep any respite from being seen? And even I began avoiding her, not that she was seeking me out much anymore, excusing myself with work that didn't exist, responsibilities that didn't exist. I think she appreciated that. At least she would be spared having to be seen by me. This, of course, left me with one less companion in the world, and so, as one does, I spent more time in the orbits of my other groups of friends, particularly the Lucos. I'd met Jeremias Luco through a mutual friend, and in time I'd become a regular guest at their weekly dinners and other family events. There was Sylvia, Peter, Janet, and Hugo, Jeremias's parents, his wife, Janet's friend Paula, Sylvia's friends Claudia and Palestrina, and 2 or 3 young men who were very interested in her, the most persistent being Olivero, Ernest, and Stefano. I think Hugo had a little friend of his own, while Peter seemed to keep his friends at a distance. I think he was at the age when family events become embarrassing. I vanished into this mob with a feeling of relief. It was a sort of social bathing. I had only to keep up my end of an incessantly interrupted conversation on literary and political topics with Jeremias, while a kaleidoscope of faces and gestures, a chamber orchestra of voices, shifted around me. The house was spacious, comfortable in a way that was not compatible with exquisite beauty, but which was so charmingly warm and accommodating that I sometimes found myself more at ease there than in my own home, particularly when I was able to stay later into the silence of the night. I attended Sylvia's birthday party at Jeremias's invitation, and she herself opened the door for me, bright-faced and breathless, whirled away by Claudia and Palestrina in the act of greeting me. For the rest of the evening, I was like the pin in the center of a glittering pinwheel. Beautiful young people, old friends, and kind faces spun around me. Sylvia was mobbed by dozens of girlfriends who flashed around me like Diana's train, filling the air with their smiles, their laughter, their bright looks and flying hair, their gestures, their singing, their music. Sylvia's mother hovered over the scene, managing to be everywhere at once, beaming, giving directions, calmly maintaining order, while Jeremias enjoyed himself with a pantomime of mock dismay at all the hubbub. Sylvia was radiant, and, as the celebration took its course, I occupied myself with the study of her 3 admirers. Olivero and Stefano were like Shakespearean characters, and one brightened with favor as the other one dimmed in neglect, only to reverse positions and reverse again. Ernest was harder to read. His smile never wavered, without ever kindling to any real light, so that I began to wonder if he was stupid. The telephone in the front hall rang incessantly with greetings from far-flung relatives, and I remember he answered at once. "This is the residence of the Luco family," he said. The incongruity of his almost insipid smiling and this ready response struck me, and I continued to speculate idly about him as the evening wore on. By the time he left, alone, clearly disappointed, his smile began to seem haggard and more like a grimace. He had none of the grace or charm of the other boys, showed no sign of real wit. He was passive and seemed to smile at his own passivity with something like the wisdom of an older man. Later, after everyone else had gone to bed, Jeremias told me that Ernest was the son of a newspaper man, and I was, by then, so tired that I for a moment imagined he meant a man cut from newspaper, like a doll. "There's not much to him, I think, poor fellow," Jeremias said. When I finally returned home that night, I found a message waiting for me, an urgent note from Amelia, begging me to come see her as soon as I could, irrespective of the time. I went at once. She was frantic when I arrived. "What kept you?" she cried, in a voice I will never be able to forget. She collapsed, all but fainted, and I was only just quick enough to catch her before her head struck the floor. I set her on the sofa. As I examined her, she began to struggle back up out of whatever trance had seized her, groping in the air, as if she could find some purchase there and pull herself back into waking life. It had been weeks since I had last seen her, and she was much deteriorated from that time. "Is he here?" she asked. "Look for me, won't you, please? I have to know if he's here. You would tell me if he were here, wouldn't you? That man in your dream? I dreamt about the man I told you about. I saw him. He was here. Or I can't be sure, but I think he was here. So I took up a lamp and made a thorough search of her spacious apartment. I was not myself in the least afraid of encountering anyone. It was Amelia's weakness and terror that made me sick at heart. Of course, there was no intruder to be found, nor any sign of one. Again and again, Amelia asked me if I were sure, and urged me to look beneath the sofa, behind furniture that couldn't have concealed a house cat, let alone a grown man. When in the end she became calm, the expression of bitterly melancholy resignation in her face and aspect were worse than the fear that had preceded it. At least her fear had been a kind of animation compared with this morbid, almost idiotic slackening of her nerves. I sat beside her and plied her with questions, hardly knowing what I was asking half the time, simply to get her to speak and to continue speaking, with the idea that conversation would help her recover herself. A pale gleam had crept into her eyes, and her voice was toneless, often barely above a whisper. The dream, as near as I could piece it together from her broken answers, involved nothing especially strange, which had been the main problem, the most shocking aspect of the dream. She had simply seen her voyeur there, in her apartment, watching her as usual. She pointed to the corner where he stood, and then to the window he had looked out of. There was a moment when he appeared to be eating something she couldn't see. Then he had turned and picked up her telephone receiver, exactly as if it had just started ringing, and she heard his voice say, "This is the residence of the Lucco family." For her sake, it was a good thing that her eyes were on her knotted hands when she said this, because it took me a moment to notice and suppress the contortion of shock that these words caused in me. I had from time to time referred to my other friends in town, but I had never named them. I had even made a point of withholding the name, prompted by a perverse desire to preserve unblended the two different social worlds to which I had access. But, of course, it wasn't the surprising introduction of that name between us that shook me, and I was unable to pay any attention to what Amelia was saying for some minutes more. When the occasion presented itself, I asked her around what time she thought she'd had the dream. "It was about 7 when I woke up," she said. "I wrote to you right away. Where were you?" "I was at a friend's house," I said. "It was his daughter's birthday today." There was a grandfather clock in the front hall of Jeremiah's house, right by the telephone. I could see it in my mind's eye, the arms at 7 o'clock, as he went to answer the phone. Day was breaking when I finally left Amelia, who assured me that, on my advice, she would go spend some time in the country and leave right away. She refused my assistance in making the arrangements, assuring me she would be gone before noon, and promising to write to me the moment she arrived. Business kept me fully occupied for several days ensuing, but I did not fail to notice that her promised letter had not come. This worried me. It wasn't like her to forget or to postpone. She had no family I could ask, and I had no idea where I might write or call to find out about her. The only personal message of any kind that I received in those days came nearly at dawn, on an aridly sunny Monday morning, in the form of a note to me from Jeremias, asking if I might be able to meet Sylvia and her friends later that day. She was attending a baptism. The child belonged to one of their many cousins. Jeremias could accompany her to the church, but pressing affairs would require him to leave immediately, and he wanted to know if I would see her safely home again in the customary way. My own business having been discharged for the moment, I sent word that I would be there. Without intending to, perhaps out of impatience, I found myself at the church very early. In fact, I don't believe the baptism had even begun. The doors to the church were shut, and I had to peer in through the windows to confirm that Sylvia was inside. I saw her from behind, sitting very still, perhaps in prayer, with two other girls I didn't recognize. There was a school for boys right next to the church, and the boys were outside playing outside at recess. I had to wade in through them to reach the window. The noise they made was incredible, and contrasted starkly with the near motionlessness and chill silence that seemed to billow palpably out from the church. The day was already hot and blindingly bright. The whitish dust kicked up by all those boys in their games seemed to hold and amplify the sun. There were so many of them. I marveled at how they all fit into that one small school building. Their classrooms were confined to a gaunt, cheerless house of pale, newly quarried stone, while the other facilities were housed in a Gothic pile that might once have been the chancery. Since I had so much time on my hands, and no way of entering the church, which was locked for the occasion, I wondered if this unusual precaution had been taken to ensure that those mischievous boys would not disrupt the baptism. I crossed to the former chancery to escape the dust cloud and to find a bit of shade for myself. There was a cloister around the front of the chancery. Had it been a monastery first, or attached to one? A door stood open not far from me, and it appeared to open on the school library. It was a double door, painted vermilion red, standing in an ogival archway. To reach it, I had to walk around the corner of a cramped loggia whose arches had been converted to glassed windows. One entered the loggia from a tiny square formed by an indentation in the outer wall of the school, and this was crammed with boys playing handball with small rubber balls. They were packed in this square so tightly that I had to elbow my way through them, and the noise, choraled by the three walls, was even worse than it was by the church. Through that glare and the tumult of the many boys, and through the double panes of glass, I caught sight of Ernest sitting on the shadowy seat by the library door. "What are you doing here?" This question formed itself spontaneously in my mind, and my surprise was so strong that I spoke it aloud. He seemed to hear, despite the din of children playing and the double pane of glass between us. His dim form fixed its gaze on me. When I entered the loggia, he had not budged from his place on the stone seat, which was almost a booth set directly into the wall. "I'm waiting for Sylvia," he said. "I've been asked to see her home directly after the baptism ends," I said. "I know," he said quietly. "I just want to see her." I stood watching him. The noise outside was almost louder by the library door than it was in the square. Someone opened a window across from us, which spattered Ernest with faint sequins of reflected sunlight, making the rest of him more murky by contrast. "I was wondering if you knew my friend, Amelia," I said. "Amelia Portraries." I don't know why I said it. I couldn't see his face clearly enough to make out what effect my words were having on him, but he shifted oddly in his seat. It wasn't immediately clear to me that he had actually moved. For a moment I thought that someone might have adjusted the position of that open window and caused the reflections to move. A moment later he stood up and was past me in a flash, although he didn't seem to be making any special effort to move quickly. I caught up with him outside, and we walked together through the children toward the church. The sun was in my eyes, and I had to shade them as we went on, but he simply kept his face forwards and his eyelids lowered. He seemed embarrassed. His lips were compressed. "I'm not talking about Sylvia, although you should leave her alone too," I said. Then, he said, his voice barely audible above the racket, "Who are you talking about?" "Sylvia's birthday party. You answered the phone. You said, 'This is the residence of the Luco family.'" I couldn't be sure. His face was turned away, but it sounded as though he said, "She saw me?" "She's an old friend of mine," I went on, "and I'm telling you to leave her alone." Ernest relaxed. He finally gazed at me, his face dappled, blank and gray under the dapple. When he spoke, his words were perfectly distinct, even though he spoke softly and ice cold. "Do you think this is good for me?" This curse I'm under? I stopped to confront him, but he did not stop. You leave her alone, I said to his back. There's no need, he said. I hurried to catch up with him. It could have happened to anyone. A step put wrong in a dream, he said. He spoke the following words as if he were no longer aware of my presence. How do you avoid putting a step wrong in your dreams? Where is any step the wrong step? I might have gotten carried away, but now I think it was the opposite. I wasn't paying close attention. I got lost. I couldn't find my way back into my own dream. I went on and on, searching for it, only getting myself more and more lost in other people's dreams. And they're so interesting. So much more interesting than mine ever were, mainly because they are other people's dreams. It's impossible to look away. I have to watch and go on watching, seeing. I don't even care if they see me. What can any of us do about that? The school bell rang. Suddenly, I couldn't find Ernest. It was as if he'd kept going, turned a corner, slid into a shadow, but we were out in the middle of a plaza overflowing with the blinding light of day. He'd somehow gone away, but I felt as though he was still very near, present, unseen. I didn't see him again. The baptism ended with that bell. I escorted Sylvia home as arranged, and then returned to my own apartment. There was a letter waiting for me there, on the official stationery of a small country town I had never heard of before, informing me that Amelia had been killed there in a traffic accident. The signatory was the town clerk, who had been an eyewitness to the accident. She had attracted his notice because she'd seemed dazed and nearly fainting, weaving down the sidewalk like someone struggling with a heavy, unbalanced burden. Then she tripped, stumbled, blundered out into the street directly in front of an accelerating truck. They found a letter from me in her bag, and, as I was the only contact they could find, it was decided that I should be the one to receive formal notice of her death. I remembered what Ernest had said the very moment she died. There's no need. When I'd last seen Amelia in the gloom of early morning, her wan face was luminous, like the moon behind thick fog. She told me that she was afraid that this stranger was becoming one with her dreams, so that in time he would no longer appear in them. Not because he was gone, certainly, and not because he would be there, watching her dream, but invisible to her, but because he would have, by then, become her dream altogether. Then he would be dreaming her. She told me, too, that she had only come to fear death all the more, because she now believed that, in death, you are forever exposed to a gaze, to the steady and unblinking gaze of an unknown watcher in a dream that cannot end.